June 6, 1962. A textile mill in the rural South. Morning shift. Hundreds of women working at sewing machines, stitching fabric in long rows under fluorescent lights. The hum of machines, the summer heat building even though it's barely 9 a.m. A woman at her sewing station suddenly feels dizzy, nauseous. Her vision blurs. She tells her supervisor she feels faint. She's sent home. The next day, 3 more women develop the same symptoms. Dizziness, nausea, numbness in their limbs. Some vomit. Some collapse at their machines. They're convinced something is wrong with them. Something in the factory is making them sick. By the 3rd day, it's spreading. 5 more workers affected. Then 7. Then 12. Within 2 weeks, 62 workers, almost all women, have been stricken by this mysterious illness. The symptoms are real. The women are genuinely suffering. They're not faking. They're terrified. Some workers claim they've been bitten by an insect, a tiny bug in the fabric they're sewing. They describe seeing small bugs jumping or crawling. The word spreads. There's an insect infestation in the textile shipments. Something poisonous. Something that's making people sick. The factory shuts down. Public health officials descend on the facility. Entomologists search for the bug. Toxicologists test the fabrics and dyes. Environmental specialists check the ventilation. Medical doctors examine the workers. They find nothing. No bugs. No toxins. No contamination. No physical cause for the illness whatsoever. But 62 workers were sick. Their symptoms were real. So what happened? This is the story of the June bug epidemic, one of the most thoroughly documented cases of mass psychogenic illness in American history. A case that proved the mind can create genuine physical symptoms that spread through a community like a contagion, even when there's no biological cause. And a case that revealed uncomfortable truths about workplace stress, gender, and how we decide what counts as real illness. The factory. The factory was a textile mill in a small southern town. The exact location was kept anonymous in published reports to protect the workers and company. It employed about 200 workers, the vast majority women, working in shifts to process and sew fabric. The work was repetitive and demanding. Women sat at sewing machines for hours, performing the same motions thousands of times per day. The pace was fast. Production quotas had to be met. The pay was modest. For many workers, this was one of the few employment options available in a rural area with limited opportunities. The working conditions were typical for 1962 textile mills. Warm, humid, noisy, with rows of workers at machines under fluorescent lighting. Ventilation was adequate but not exceptional. The work was boring and physically taxing. Hours of repetitive motion, hunched over machines. But there was nothing obviously hazardous about the work. No dangerous chemicals, no extreme heat, no known toxins. Just the ordinary, grinding monotony of industrial textile work. Patient 0. On June 6, 1962, a worker reported feeling ill. She experienced dizziness, nausea, and weakness. Her symptoms came on suddenly during her shift. She told her supervisor, was examined briefly, and was sent home to rest. This initial case wouldn't have been particularly notable. People get sick. But it was the beginning of a pattern. The next day, June 7th, 3 more workers reported similar symptoms during their shift. Same complaints. Dizziness, nausea, weakness, some numbness in extremities. The symptoms seemed to come on suddenly, without warning. By June 8th, 5 more workers were affected. The pattern was becoming clear. Something was happening in the factory, and it was spreading. The bug hypothesis. As more workers fell ill, a narrative began to emerge. Some workers claimed they'd been bitten by an insect. A small bug, they said, probably in the fabric shipments. Maybe it had come from England. The factory processed some imported fabric. Maybe it was poisonous. The description varied. Some said it was like a small beetle, others a mite, others couldn't quite describe it. Some said they'd seen bugs jumping. Others found small insects on their fabric but couldn't capture them to show supervisors. This explanation made sense to the workers. Textile mills occasionally had issues with insects in fabric shipments. Moths, beetles, mites. and insect bites could cause illness, allergic reactions, infections. The June bug narrative spread through the workplace. Workers began talking about the mysterious insect. Some became hypervigilant, watching their fabric for bugs. Anxiety increased. More workers reported symptoms. By mid-June, the outbreak had affected 62 workers over the course of about 2 weeks. The factory was in crisis. The symptoms. The affected workers experienced a constellation of symptoms. Dizziness and lightheadedness most common. Nausea and vomiting very common. Numbness or tingling in extremities common. Weakness and fatigue common. Difficulty breathing or feeling of breathlessness some cases. Rapid heartbeat some cases. Fainting or near fainting several cases. These symptoms were real. The women weren't pretending. Medical examinations confirmed they were experiencing genuine physical distress. Elevated heart rates, sweating, visible signs of nausea. But here's what doctors noticed. The symptoms were diverse and didn't match any specific poison or toxin. Different workers had different combinations of symptoms. The severity varied widely, and the symptoms resolved relatively quickly, usually within hours to a day without any specific treatment. This pattern didn't fit with insect envenomation, toxic exposure, or infectious disease. It fit with something else, psychogenic illness. The investigation begins. As the outbreak escalated, the factory management did the responsible thing. They called in experts. Multiple teams descended on the facility. Entomologists from the State Department of Agriculture came to find the bug. They searched fabric shipments, inspected the facility, set traps. They were looking for any insect that could be causing the symptoms. Environmental health specialists tested air quality, ventilation, temperature, humidity. They were looking for environmental factors that might be making workers sick. Toxicologists tested fabric samples, dyes, and chemicals used in the facility. They were looking for any toxic substance that could cause the reported symptoms. Medical doctors examined the affected workers, took blood samples, ran tests. They were looking for signs of infection, poisoning, or other medical conditions. And they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. No toxic insects. No environmental hazards. No chemical contamination. No infectious agent. No medical abnormalities in the workers' blood tests or physical exams. The investigators were thorough. This wasn't a cursory look. They spent days examining every aspect of the facility and the workers. They used the best available scientific methods of 1962. Result: no physical cause for the illness could be identified. The demographics. When investigators analyzed who was affected, a clear pattern emerged. Gender. All 62 affected workers were women. Not one man working in the facility reported symptoms. Age. The affected workers were primarily younger, under 40, though age range varied. Work location. The outbreak was concentrated in specific areas of the factory, primarily the sections where workers did repetitive sewing tasks. Shift. Most cases occurred during day shifts, with fewer evening/night shift cases. Social networks. Workers who were friends or worked near each other were more likely to both be affected. This demographic pattern was significant. If the cause were environmental, a toxin, contamination, insect, you'd expect random distribution across all workers in the affected areas. Men and women breathing the same air, working with the same materials, should be equally affected. But that's not what happened. The pattern suggested something else. Social contagion. The psychological investigation. The factory management, frustrated by the lack of physical findings and facing continued worker illness and anxiety, called in psychological researchers. A team from a nearby university, including medical sociologists and psychologists, began studying the outbreak. They conducted extensive interviews with affected workers, unaffected workers, supervisors, and management. They administered psychological assessments. They examined workplace conditions and stress factors. What they found was a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness, though that term didn't exist yet in 1962. At the time, such phenomena were still often called mass hysteria, a term that's now recognized as stigmatizing and inaccurate. The stress factors. The psychological investigation revealed significant workplace stressors affecting the predominantly female workforce. Work monotony. The sewing work was extremely repetitive. Same motion thousands of times daily, for hours on end. This kind of repetitive work without mental engagement is psychologically taxing. Production pressure. Workers faced strict production quotas. The pace was demanding. Falling behind could mean reprimand or job loss. This created constant low-level stress. Economic insecurity. For many workers, this job was essential to family income. Fear of job loss was ever present. There were few other employment options in the area. Limited control. Workers had little autonomy. They couldn't control their pace, take breaks when needed, or make decisions about their work. This lack of control is a significant psychological stressor. Physical discomfort. The work was physically uncomfortable. Sitting in the same position for hours, repetitive strain, heat, noise. Not dangerous, but chronically uncomfortable. Social isolation despite proximity. Workers sat at individual machines, focused on their own work, unable to easily socialize. You're surrounded by people but functionally isolated. These stressors were chronic. They'd existed before the outbreak. But they'd created a workforce that was psychologically primed for a psychogenic illness outbreak. The trigger. The researchers identified the likely trigger. That first worker who fell ill on June 6th. Her illness was probably genuine. Perhaps she had a virus, perhaps she was particularly stressed that day, perhaps she had low blood sugar. Whatever the cause, she felt sick and went home. But her illness became the seed for something larger. When other workers heard about it, some began to wonder, am I feeling okay? Now that you mention it, I do feel a bit dizzy. Humans constantly experience minor physical sensations. Slight dizziness, mild nausea, muscle tension, fatigue. Normally, we ignore these as background noise. But when we're told there's a threat, we become hypervigilant. We start paying attention to every sensation. This is called somatic amplification. Normal bodily sensations become amplified and interpreted as symptoms of illness. The spread mechanism. Once the bug narrative emerged, the spread followed a predictable pattern. Stage 1 initial case. First worker gets sick, genuine illness, unrelated cause. Stage 2 attention and anxiety. Other workers hear about it, become concerned, start paying attention to their own physical sensations. Stage 3 attribution. Someone suggests it might be a bug in the fabric. This provides a concrete explanation that makes sense in the context of a textile mill. Stage 4 hypervigilance. Workers start watching for bugs, monitoring their own symptoms. Some report seeing small insects, likely normal insects that are always present but usually ignored. Stage 5 social contagion. When one worker reports symptoms, others nearby witness it. This activates their own anxiety and somatic awareness. They start experiencing similar symptoms. Stage 6 amplification. Each new case reinforces the belief that there's something dangerous in the factory. Anxiety increases. More people become symptomatic. Stage 7 epidemic. The outbreak reaches a critical mass where a significant portion of the vulnerable population, women under workplace stress, has been affected. This isn't conscious or deliberate. The workers genuinely felt sick. Their symptoms were real physical sensations. But the cause was psychological stress manifesting as physical symptoms, spread through social networks by anxiety and suggestion. The bug explained. So what about the bug? Some workers insisted they'd seen it. Some even claimed to have been bitten. The investigators' explanation: normal insects, textile mills, like any industrial facility, have normal insect populations. Flies, gnats, occasional beetles. These are always present but usually ignored. Once workers started looking for bugs, they noticed them. Pareidolia and misidentification. Under stress and expecting to see something, people sometimes misidentify normal stimuli. A speck of dust, a fiber, a shadow. In the right mindset, these can look like insects. Sensation misattribution. Normal skin sensations, itching, tingling from fabric fibers, muscle twitches, can be interpreted as bug bites when you're expecting them. Social reinforcement. If one person says, "I saw a bug," others look harder and become more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as bugs. No actual biting or stinging insect was ever found, despite extensive searching by professional entomologists. The gender question. Why were only women affected? This is one of the most significant aspects of the June bug epidemic and remains true in most mass psychogenic illness outbreaks. Several factors likely contributed. Workplace stress. The women had less power, less job security, more monotonous work, and often faced additional stressors at home, childcare, domestic responsibilities. Expressiveness norms. Cultural norms in 1962 made it more acceptable for women to express physical distress. Men facing similar stress might have experienced symptoms but felt pressure to suppress or deny them. Social networks. Women workers were more socially connected to each other, facilitating social contagion. Men worked in different areas with less interaction. Attention and belief. Once the outbreak was identified among women, it reinforced the pattern. Male workers might have felt ill but attributed it to other causes or didn't report it. This gender pattern doesn't mean women are hysterical or weak, a sexist interpretation that was unfortunately common in 1962. It means women in this situation were under more stress and had fewer resources to cope with it. Breaking the news. The researchers faced a delicate challenge. How do you tell workers that their illness is psychological without making them feel dismissed or accused of faking? The term mass hysteria was problematic. It suggested irrationality, weakness, even mental illness. The workers weren't mentally ill. They were normal people responding to chronic stress in a way that their bodies manifested as physical symptoms. The researchers chose careful language. They emphasized the symptoms were real, not imaginary. They explained that stress can cause genuine physical illness. They acknowledged the difficult working conditions. They proposed environmental improvements to reduce stress. They avoided blaming individual workers. This approach was important. If workers felt dismissed or accused of faking, it would increase stress and potentially worsen symptoms. The company response. To the company's credit, they took the findings seriously. They implemented several changes. Environmental improvements, improved ventilation and air conditioning, better lighting, more frequent breaks, reduced production quotas temporarily. Communication. Management explained the findings clearly and respectfully. They reassured workers there was no ongoing danger. They acknowledged the reality of workplace stress. Medical support. A nurse was stationed at the facility for workers who felt unwell. Workers were given time off to recover without penalty. Gradual return. The factory reopened gradually, not all at once. This prevented overwhelming workers with anxiety about returning. The outcome. The interventions worked. New cases stopped appearing. Workers who had been affected recovered fully. The epidemic ended as mysteriously as it had begun. But not immediately. Some workers remained skeptical of the psychological explanation. Some continued to believe there had been a bug that was simply never found. This isn't surprising. Accepting that your physical symptoms were psychological feels like being told they weren't real, even though that's not accurate. Over time, as no new cases appeared and as working conditions improved, the anxiety decreased. The factory returned to normal operations. The scientific legacy. The June bug epidemic became one of the most famous and thoroughly studied cases of mass psychogenic illness in scientific literature. Multiple papers were published analyzing the outbreak. The case was significant because excellent documentation. Researchers had access to everyone involved. They could interview workers, examine medical records, study the timeline. This level of access is rare. Clear pattern, the demographic patterns, the social network spread, the lack of physical cause, everything pointed clearly to psychogenic illness. Workplace context. It demonstrated how occupational stress can contribute to mass psychogenic illness. This had implications for workplace health and safety. Gender and stress. It illuminated how gender, power dynamics, and workplace conditions interact to create vulnerability to psychogenic illness. Intervention success. It showed that appropriate interventions, stress reduction, environmental improvements, respectful communication can resolve such outbreaks. The case is still taught in medical schools, public health programs, and occupational health courses as a classic example of mass psychogenic illness. Comparable cases. The June bug epidemic wasn't unique. Similar outbreaks have occurred in factories and schools worldwide. 1965 British factory. Workers in an electronics assembly plant reported dizziness and fainting. Investigation found no physical cause. Pattern similar to June bug. 1972 data entry outbreak. Women working at computer terminals developed neurological symptoms, initially blamed on radiation from monitors, eventually determined to be stress-related. 1974 Pennsylvania schools. Multiple schools reported students fainting and experiencing symptoms attributed to gas leak. No leak found. Mass psychogenic illness. 1998 Tennessee school. Similar to June bug, claims of toxic exposure, but investigation found psychological cause. These outbreaks share common features, affect primarily women in work/school settings, occur in contexts of high stress and low control, spread through social networks, feature real physical symptoms with no physical cause, resolve when stress is addressed and anxiety reduced. The pattern is consistent across cultures and time periods, suggesting fundamental human psychological mechanisms at work. What it teaches us about work. The June bug epidemic revealed uncomfortable truths about industrial work in America. Work stress is real. The monotonous, controlled, quota-driven work environment was genuinely harmful to workers' well-being. The psychogenic illness was a symptom of workplace dysfunction, not worker weakness. Control matters. Workers with no autonomy, no control over pace or conditions, are under more psychological stress. This has been confirmed by decades of subsequent research. Monotony is harmful. Highly repetitive work without mental engagement is psychologically taxing. Humans aren't designed for that kind of labor. Economic insecurity creates stress. Fear of job loss, financial precarity. These are significant chronic stressors that affect physical health. Gender and power. Women workers in 1962 faced disadvantages that compounded workplace stress, lower pay, fewer opportunities, less power, expectations of domestic labor on top of paid work. These conditions haven't entirely disappeared. Many modern workplaces, call centers, data entry, assembly lines, warehouse fulfillment, feature similar conditions. Repetitive work, production quotas, limited autonomy, economic insecurity. The mind-body connection. The June bug case demonstrates the profound connection between psychological state and physical symptoms. Stress creates physical illness. Chronic stress doesn't just make you feel bad. It causes measurable physical changes. Elevated cortisol, immune suppression, cardiovascular effects, gastrointestinal problems. Somatic symptoms are real. When stress manifests as physical symptoms, headache, nausea, dizziness, those symptoms are genuine. You're not imagining the pain. Social contagion is powerful. Humans are deeply social. We unconsciously mimic those around us. In high-stress environments, symptoms can spread through social networks. Attention amplifies sensation. When we focus on bodily sensations, they become more intense. Anxiety about health makes us hypervigilant to normal variations in how we feel. Belief shapes experience. If you believe you've been exposed to something harmful, your body can produce symptoms consistent with that belief, even without actual exposure. None of this means the symptoms are all in your head in the dismissive sense. The symptoms are produced by the brain, but they're experienced in the body. They're real. Modern relevance. Mass psychogenic illness hasn't disappeared. Modern examples. Wind turbine syndrome. Some people living near wind turbines report symptoms, headaches, nausea, insomnia. They attribute to low-frequency noise. Studies show no correlation between symptoms and turbine operation, but symptoms are real, likely psychogenic response to concern about turbines. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Some people report symptoms from Wi-Fi, cell phones, power lines. Double-blind studies show no correlation between symptoms and actual exposure, but sufferers genuinely feel ill. Psychogenic response to fear of technology. Multiple chemical sensitivity. Controversial condition where people report severe reactions to ordinary environmental chemicals. Evidence suggests psychogenic mechanism in many cases, though debate continues. Social media and illness. TikTok tics, discussed earlier, represent a modern form, symptoms spreading through digital social networks rather than physical proximity. The same mechanisms operate. Stress, anxiety, attention to symptoms, social reinforcement, belief-shaping experience. The stigma problem. One reason mass psychogenic illness is problematic: the stigma attached to psychological illness. When the Junebug workers were told their illness was psychological, many felt dismissed. They interpreted psychological as meaning, "You're imagining it. It's not real. You're mentally unstable. It's your fault." None of these interpretations are accurate. Psychogenic symptoms are real physical sensations, not consciously produced, not signs of mental illness, not anyone's fault. But cultural stigma around mental health means psychological feels like a dismissal rather than an explanation. This stigma has consequences. People resist psychological explanations even when evidence supports them. Genuine psychogenic illness goes untreated while people search for physical causes. Resources are wasted on unnecessary medical testing. The underlying stress that caused symptoms isn't addressed. We need better language and better understanding of the mind-body connection. The prevention question: can mass psychogenic illness outbreaks be prevented? Based on the Junebug case and subsequent research, address workplace stress, give workers more autonomy and control, reduce monotonous, repetitive work, provide adequate breaks, ensure reasonable workload and quotas, improve physical working conditions, foster psychological safety, create environments where workers can report concerns without fear, take health complaints seriously, provide access to mental health resources, reduce economic insecurity, improve communication. When concerning symptoms appear, investigate thoroughly but don't assume the worst. Communicate findings clearly and respectfully. Acknowledge the reality of symptoms even if cause is psychological. Avoid stigmatizing language. Support social connection. Allow workers to interact and build relationships. Reduce isolation. Foster supportive workplace culture. These interventions not only prevent mass psychogenic illness, they improve overall worker well-being and productivity. The Junebug that never was. In June 1962, 62 workers in a textile mill got sick from a bug that didn't exist. They weren't lying. They weren't hysterical. They weren't weak or foolish. They were human beings under chronic stress, working in monotonous conditions with little control over their lives, experiencing the very real physical manifestations of psychological strain. When one person got sick and the bug explanation emerged, it provided a concrete, socially acceptable explanation for feeling unwell. The symptoms spread through social networks, amplified by anxiety and attention, creating a genuine epidemic of genuine illness, without any biological pathogen. The investigation revealed no mysterious insect, no toxin, no physical threat. What it revealed instead was more troubling. A workplace where conditions were grinding down workers' psychological well-being until their bodies began manifesting distress signals. The real lesson: the Junebug epidemic wasn't about a bug. It was about work, stress, power, and the profound ways our minds and bodies are connected. It taught us that psychological stress creates physical illness. Workplace conditions affect worker health in complex ways. Gender, power, and economic insecurity compound vulnerability. Human beings are social creatures whose symptoms can spread through networks. Psychological doesn't mean not real. The uncomfortable truth. The most uncomfortable aspect of the Junebug case. It forces us to confront how we organize work in industrial societies. Those workers weren't sick because they were defective. They were sick because the conditions of their labor were making them sick. The psychogenic illness was a symptom of a dysfunctional system. And that system still exists. Maybe not textile mills exactly, but the same dynamics. Repetitive work, production quotas, low autonomy, economic insecurity, isolation despite proximity to others. How many modern workers are under the same stresses? How many warehouse workers, call center employees, data entry clerks, gig workers, experiencing chronic stress from conditions similar to that 1962 textile mill? The June bug epidemic ended in 1962, but the conditions that created it haven't entirely disappeared. Sometimes, when our bodies start manifesting distress, the problem isn't that we're weak or hysterical or imagining things. The problem is that the conditions we're living and working under are genuinely harmful, and our bodies are trying to tell us something. The workers in that textile mill weren't sick because of a bug. They were sick because of how we organize labor, because of stress and powerlessness, because human beings aren't designed for that kind of existence. There was no June bug, but there was something in that factory making people sick. Something real, something dangerous, something that 62 people's bodies were desperately trying to signal. They just called it by the wrong name.